Welcome back to another video lecture. Mr. King, American Studies. This time we're going to take a look at labor in the Gilded Age. So far we've talked quite a bit about the capitalist revolution that swept the United States in the Gilded Age, 1877 to 1900, the growth and concentration of large corporations and trusts, the accumulation of wealth through the creation of monopolies that, created great jobs and created new markets and unified the country using new technology and new business practices. And we think of this as a great success, and it was in many ways. We now want to turn our attention to another group in this story of the United States at this time period of great transformation, and that is labor. And that's sort of a story that is often not told, often unknown by many Americans. And so we'll look at the term itself and get started with a couple of essential questions that will help guide us and we can come back to at the end. So owners of large corporations and trusts had unlimited power and wealth. Think of Carnegie, Rockefeller, Morgan, Duke, Swift, etc. Those are the names of the great industrialists and trust owners. What power did the workers have on the other hand? And I think that's a fair and valid question. Did they have any power? If they did, how could they use that power, to achieve their goals and in a way to improve their life and position in life? So that's one of the questions we'll look at. What caused, however, many Americans to come to distrust unions in this time period? And I think, again, I've been trying to emphasize the connection between the past and the present. I think today there is still a great deal of distrust among many Americans with regards to labor unions and what they do, what they stand for, and how they operate. So that's an interesting question that we'll look at in history and then see if there's any connection and relevance to today as well. And the last question, I guess, that follows the second question, that is the distrust of unions. So are unions themselves consistent with the American values that we've been trying to identify and define throughout the course of the month of September? So those are the questions. You see a bunch of workers down below holding up signs, living wages, 8-hour workday, organize, etc. So moving on. I think one of the first things we need to address is just what is labor. That's a term that's not necessarily clear, so let's start with a basic definition. It may not be the most complete, but labor are those individuals who exchange their work, that is their labor, for wages, money paid by an employer. Now, something I didn't put up on the screen is that labor usually refers to workers that do manual labor. That is, they work with their hands or their bodies doing physical work, putting things together, making things, and that's the labor that we're really talking about. So today, when we talk about labor, it's often tricky because so many of the jobs that we think about when we think of labor, such as the manufacture of cars or computers, electronics, are now done by machines, by robots. So the labor has changed greatly over the past 100 years or so. And that goes to the next point. So even in this Gilded Age, 1877 to 1900, we can look at two classes or groups of labor: the skilled laborer versus the unskilled laborer. I think that term is relatively clear, at least I hope it is, so ask if you have a question. The other thing I just want to kind of mention, that when we think about labor, two things come into play: time and technology. And both time and technology greatly changed the workplace in the United States, how people worked, where they worked, and this all occurred during the Gilded Age. And so we look at the idea of time. Before the Gilded Age in the factories, people worked in their homes or in their villages, on their farms, and largely, to a large extent that is, people controlled time. They did things when they wanted. They got up as the sun rose. They worked when they did. They took breaks when they could or needed to tend to other family business, and then they got back to work. So people were really kind of autonomous, that is, independent. With the advent of the factory floor that you see there pictured, people lost control of time. You had to show up at work at a specific time, stay there for a specific amount of time, leave at a certain time, and come back and start it all over. And there was no flexibility, very rigid. Maybe that sounds a little bit like school for students, and it is really, because we're run and governed by the clock and the bell at school. So think about that. And technology really led to the de-skilling or unskilling of labor in the Gilded Age. As new inventions, new machines, new processes were developed and perfected, labor became less, or skilled labor became less and less in demand, and unskilled labor began to dominate. So I guess the question we might ask here is, were the changes in labor progress? Again, that idea of progress, moving forward, getting better. And so that's a question to ask. A couple of statistics I want to share with you. In 1870, there were 350,000 women in the workforce. By 1900, there were some 1.2 million women in the workforce. And if you look at point number 2, I think you'll understand why there was such an increase in women in the workforce. Men, on average, earn from $7 to $9 a week. Seems paltry in today's dollars, but back then was a substantial wage. Women, on the other hand, only earned $1.56 a week. So we see this great pay gap between the genders, something that still exists and is still talked about quite a lot today, in fact. And I think that explains why so many women entered the workforce. It was very advantageous for corporations to hire women because they could pay them less, and that improved a corporation's profits. And again, the goal of capitalism, free market capitalism, is profits and to accumulate wealth. Point number 3 also highlights another problem, that is the idea of child labor. And 13% of textile workers at this time period, were below the age of 16. There were no mandatory schools. They were coming into existence by the end of the 1800s, around the turn of the century, 1900. In fact, Radner's found that, I believe, in 1893. But most kids, simply put, didn't go to school. They worked at home, they worked on the farms, or they worked in factories. So you might think of school as a factory, but if you look at that factory floor there and think about the work that those laborers are doing, I'm not sure it's the same thing. So moving forward, one of the big challenges that labor faced in the Gilded Age? Well, there were two. The two big challenges were wages, how much workers earned, and working conditions. And so we already talked about wages in terms of men and women, men earning between $7 and $9 a week, women $1.56. Children probably even earned less than women. Working conditions, well, let me just talk about wages first. Most employers believed in what was known as the iron law of wages, and that is the supply of workers and the number of workers needed or demanded determined wage levels. Employers argued that workers enjoyed substantial freedoms in the United States, and that if they did not like their job, their wages, or their working conditions, they were free to move somewhere else in search of a better job. And I think that idea continues down to today. That is, if we're dissatisfied with our lot in life, where we are, we tend to then pick up and move in search of something better. Workers, however, on the other hand, did not really like this iron law of wages, and they felt that they were being exploited, that is, taken advantage of by employers who were able to, in fact, cut/reduce wages because of the large supply of workers. And we noticed that more and more women enter the workforce, more and more children are entering the workforce. And remember that this is a time of great immigration. So there are more and more immigrants entering the country seeking work, and therefore there was a great supply of workers. There weren't necessarily always enough jobs. And so if people were frustrated, if one was frustrated with the job, they really had no choice but to stay on the job, because there was always another worker who would be willing to do the same job for less pay, less wages. So that's an interesting idea. And when we talk about working conditions, you see a factory floor there. I don't know exactly what they're making, but there are lots of moving parts, lots of machines, heavy tools, big pieces, and what often happened were what we would call workplace accidents. And so workplaces are quite dangerous. Often people were maimed. They would lose a limb, a hand, an arm. They would become mangled, caught up in machinery, etc. And at this time, there was no safety net, no social safety net to provide for families if a worker became sick, ill, or a worker became disabled through a workplace accident. And there were also a number of deaths that occurred each year, too. So I know this is outside our time period, but in the year 1913, historians estimate that upwards of 25,000 workers died in workplace accidents across the country. That's about the same number of people they think that die in auto accidents today each year. So it's a substantial number of people. And I guess you would ask, well, why didn't anybody do anything about this? Well, because of the prevailing laissez-faire attitudes and the social Darwinist doctrines of the Gilded Age, governments really did not step in to do anything using the state action doctrine or theory to protect the workers. If anything, government stepped in to help the companies, the corporations, protect the corporations, not necessarily the workers who were doing the work and also often suffering the consequences of dangerous workplaces. So that's kind of an irony there that, and I don't know what to make of that. So that's something that we can think about. We can also see that in several states, reformers were able to get the state to finally act. And we'll see this in New York State in the early 1900s. The states acted by passing laws to restrict working hours and to improve working conditions. And there was a famous case that came to the Supreme Court of the United States. That case was known as Lochner versus New York. Lochner was the owner of a bakery. He employed a lot of bakers. Bakers worked 12 to 14-hour shifts in very hot conditions, very confined conditions. They breathed in the fine flour dust all day long. So very unhealthy, very unsafe, very uncomfortable environment. The state of New York passed laws to regulate that, limit the number of hours, and try to make the workplace safer. All that sounds great. State action works. The state is finally stepping in to protect the actual individual worker. Well, this case got to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court decided in favor of Lochner, that is the owner of the bakery, saying that the state had no right to interfere with Lochner and his employees in contracts. So the idea is that workers are free to enter into contracts with their employers, and that the state may not in any way regulate that. And this is known as the doctrine of economic due process. And so it's I think, a clear victory for laissez-faire capitalism. We're going to look at another case, the Wabash case of 1886, where we also see state regulations and restrictions of corporations being struck down by the court in favor of, again, this laissez-faire approach. So the question then, I think, becomes, well, what is it that workers could do? And the answer then becomes the Working Man's Association or the labor union, and that's what you see up there. One of the things I want to point out, though, quickly to the left is the capitalist market. The ups and the downs, the volatile swings in the capitalist market, and that's something we just need to keep in the back of our mind. And here's why: because when we see the economy trend down, and you can see those lines going down, it was very difficult for working men and women to join labor movements and labor unions. It was difficult. When times get better and there are more jobs, better wages, unions tended to be stronger in history. So let's take a look at one of the first trade unions and one of the biggest union movements in the United States and in the 19th century, at least. And anyway, that was the Knights of Labor, and you can see a medieval knight. In fact, the Knights of Labor took their name and their image from the medieval knights, who were supposed to be valorous and chivalrous and fighting for a just cause. In the Middle Ages, it was Christianity, and the Knights of Labor are going to fight on behalf of worker rights. The Knights of Labor formed in 1859 right here in Philadelphia. They were part of a garment cutters union. They cut cloth to make clothes. The 1873 panic really hurt most unions in the country. There was another union called the National Labor Union that actually went out of existence as a result of that financial panic. However, the Knights of Labor survived. And in fact, after that panic of 1873, the Knights of Labor become really, really popular. And I guess the question then becomes, why did the Knights of Labor become so popular? And in fact, in 1879, the Knights of Labor counted only 10,000 members, but by 1886, 7 years later, the number had risen to 730,000. 730,000. So in the next lecture, what we're going to do is begin to address the question of why the Knights of Labor were able to increase membership in their union by so much. And I think there's several explanations for that. Thank you very much.